But now we're recording.
Okay.
Well,
Well, great to be with you. So you're Peter. I am Simon. We connected on Substack. Peter, tell me a little bit about yourself. What are you doing?
sure. I'm full-time tutoring at the moment when I'm not posting rambling thoughts
All right.
online. Yeah, I'll be teaching in September. I graduated last summer, so I'm just starting out in things. Yeah.
So you said you're full-time tutoring. Are you a grad student?
I'm not. No, I'm just so I finished my undergrad last summer, and then I'm literally just tutoring, and I'm trying to get more involved in some prenatalist stuff, and that's pretty much mostly what I'm doing at the moment.
So you're a freelance independent tutor
Exactly. Yeah.
for philosophy?
For PPE, so mostly economics, actually, mostly econ stuff. I've
Very
just
cool.
posted a load of YouTube, like A level. If you know the A level, it's like the
No, we don't
English
have that in
AP.
America.
Yeah, like it's like the English version of the AP. So I've posted a load of like A level economics stuff up on YouTube recently to get like 10 views a video or whatever. That'll be fun.
All right. I actually studied economics as well in undergrad and grad school. Now I work for a political organization in Washington.
Cool. Yeah. Yeah, I know it's interesting stuff. I was taking a look through your Substack again. And obviously, I've been subscribed to you for a few months now. Anyway, I can't remember when I signed up exactly. But I was taking a look through some of your articles again earlier. It was good stuff. It was interesting stuff.
Thank you. Well, I think you wanted to talk about um, bugs, right? And I wrote an article about meaning and bugs feeling pain.
Yeah, I think you wrote two or three on animals and meaning because I remember you wrote one on bugs contra Kaplan, where
Yes,
Kaplan
that
said
was one.
obviously bugs don't have rights, and you said that his reasoning was bad. I didn't really take issue with your article there. I took issue with your article saying animals can't have meaning, and that's what sets us apart and means that humans have infinite more worth than animals. Is that a fair, maybe not literally infinite, but is that
I
a
don't know about
reasonable?
infinite. I mean, I do think that animal interests matter somewhat.
Yeah.
I was a very strict ethical vegan for about 5 years
All right.
for animal rights reasons. Yes, I did. It had pretty bad health effects for me, and after 5 years, anyway couldn't take it anymore. So I now eat some animal products. But yeah, I'm very sympathetic to the idea that animals have moral worth, and I think that factory farming is very wrong. And I think it's just obviously wrong to keep an animal in a tiny cage, standing in its own feces and suffering for you know uh, days or
Yeah.
years on end. There are
Yeah,
some
I
people who
think
think that like factory farming is worse than genocide of humans, which I do not agree with. I think that
I think we're
humans are.
both. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I agree that we should push back on that kind of view. I'm not going to take a sort of Bentham's bulldog kind of stance
Right.
for sure. I think, I mean, in the end, based on what you've just told me, maybe you put more weight on animal suffering than I do, because I eat chicken without feeling huge guilt. I'm I'm kind of okay with it. We used to keep chickens when I was young, and I see they are brutal to each other. They are brutal. So
Mm.
because they're such simple creatures, and if one of them is injured and they see red, they when they see red, they peck. They just peck, and they will just peck out the injured hen alive. They would go. So I think a creature that's so vicious, even though it has capacity for suffering, I'm quite. And I'll draw on this later in my argument later. I'm quite contractarian in this kind of case. I think you clearly have no capacity for like cooperation with me. So why
Right.
should I go out of my way to weigh up your you are suffering. Like maybe I should weigh it up a bit, but if you're gonna be 10 times more expensive for the sake of a bit less suffering, I'm not gonna care too much about that when you have no inclination to cooperate, even with your own kind, your own species.
Yeah. What do you think about humans who would not cooperate with you at all?
But they do. There is a difference in that. So one, I'm gonna partially bite the bullet on what you've given me, but not fully. I'm not gonna say therefore, let's do factory farming of humans, obviously,
Right.
because I've got a career to protect, hopefully. So there's always that. No, I joke. But I'd say humans generally will still have a capacity to cooperate. Like the vast majority of humans have a capacity to cooperate. Very few people are psychopaths. Even psychopaths find themselves, there are functional psychopaths who act as fully productive members of society as well. And if they just make the calculation of this is in my self-interest.
Yeah, I'm not
and
sure.
so,
I'm not sure. I believe that there's the psychopaths are real, but we should come back to that point later.
yeah, it's an interesting question. But regardless, vast majority of humans have some like capacity for cooperation, some kind of cooperative potential, and that instantly means that you should weigh them more than a chicken which has zero cooperative potential. But would I weigh up somebody who I have a close, long-standing relationship with, and would I put in more effort for their well-being than a complete stranger? Well, yeah, I would. And that fits with a sort of contractarian ethics, and it also just fits with a common
Wait.
sense ethics.
What was more valuable than the complete stranger?
Someone who I have a close relationship with. It's
Oh,
like, okay,
yes.
we've established cooperation. I'm gonna wait. If I'm given a drowning pond scenario between stranger and mother, I'm gonna save my mother,
Of course. Yes.
for example. And that's, I mean, obviously you can bring in like duty to mother and whatever. But even irrespective of that, it's just, well, hey, we cooperate with each other. We've got this mutual interest in our own, in the other's well-being, just in terms of how we value each other and how
Right.
we act with each other. And so I think that has some weight. And I think that has more weight than a sense of meaning. And so to segue into your article, from what I gather, your article is saying animals don't have a sense, non-human animals don't have a sense of meaning and therefore have a lot less worth, even though they clearly do have capacity for pleasure and pain. And one, I'd push back because when I look at my dogs, I think they have a tremendous sense of meaning in their interpersonal relationships. And they care about certain people. They care about some people more than others within a family home. And they seem to genuinely get exasperated and have kind of contentment and satisfaction, care. And they have these almost like higher order emotions, you could say, rather than just responding to impulses of hunger, excitement, etc. And so I think they have some sense of meaning. It might not be as developed as a human who can have a sort of grand narrative of their life. I think the dogs are lacking in that. But I think they have some meaning. But I think we should still weigh them less than people, and that part of that is not making meaning sacrosanct and then saying that they're lower in the meaning scale. I think part of that is saying they have lower capacity to cooperate with us. They have a great deal of capacity to cooperate with us, and that's great. And we should care for our pets and our companions, and we shouldn't treat them terribly. But also, they
I
have
think that
lower
dogs are a
capacity.
special case because dogs have been bred to interact with humans.
Yeah,
Like, for example, there are there are really no animals in the wild who will sacrifice their own life to save a non kin animal. usually, and most of them would not sacrifice their own life to save even a child. And the lower animals would never do any self-sacrifice for any reason. Dogs are the exception, though. There have been dogs who have died trying to rescue their owners from something. So
yeah, I think it's incredible, and I think dogs are
yes,
man's
I
best
think that
friend.
dogs are a special case. And of course, I do not eat dogs, and I don't think anyone should.
Sound.
But for other animals, even
I
like,
would say we should weight a dog. Sorry to.
go ahead.
I hope I didn't cut you off, but I think we should weight a dog more than a chimp, for example.
I agree.
Partly because of this cooperative capacity.
Yes, yeah, it has something to do with cooperative capacity. If we're looking at even animals like cats or pigs, it seems like I think that meaning does have to have something to do with the grand narrative of their life. I think that obviously social animals have affection for other animals in their pack or their herd or their kin. I think that's a bit different than meaning, though. So, for example, I'd be sympathetic to the idea that maybe if you're going to slaughter sheep, maybe it's really best to like slaughter a whole herd of sheep at the same time so they don't mourn the lost sheep. But I still think I don't think the sheep are losing out on any meaning if they're all slaughtered at the same time, which would be very different from like slaughtering a whole tribe of Amazonian uncontacted people.
Yeah, certainly. Although I think, I guess what I would push back on is I think that animals have a sense of sort of transitory meaning because they get a lot of this sort of deeper contentment in the moment from their relationships or even from their achievements. Like, great, I got a kill. If my dog catches something, the dog's like really chuffed with herself.
Yes.
And so they have these sorts of transitory meaning. But I'd agree with you that as far as we're aware, all non-human animals lack this narrative capacity. Although we may be wrong in that. I mean, ants build civilizations and have wars, as far as we can see. So
I don't think it's a civilization.
well, they built these very complicated social structures and have conflicts and seem to have sort of but so I'm just saying, as far as we know, it's unknown how alike they are in their little world. It's an unknown. But yeah, so as far as what we can like properly show, demonstrably show, then humans are unique until proven otherwise in this grand narrative respect. But I suppose I would also question why is that the greatest good?
I think it's just obviously the greatest good, but you don't need to agree with me that it's the greatest good to just think it has some value. And it's a it's a valuable thing that humans have and non-human animals do not. And we're ignoring dogs for the moment because most people do not eat them.
For sure.
What do you think about wild animal suffering?
Sorry?
What do you think about wild animal suffering?
Yeah. Well, just to reply, I did really like your piece on the meaning, and I think it made a really interesting point, and I restacked it, and I thought that it was really cool. So I don't so much disagree with you as think that it doesn't. That's why I wanted to bring in this kind of cooperative potential, because I think that has additional explaining power, and the meaning. I get quite a virtue ethics vibe from a lot of what your writing is, and I think that fits with, say, like, hey, the narrative is important and the pursuit of the good virtuous life. And I suppose once you accept that kind of premise, then it does make sense to elevate as the greatest good. But I was just wanting to explore the extent to which it could show things without having to accept certain kind of meta-ethical and normative ethical premises first. In terms of wild animal suffering, I don't know. I've not thought about it, to be honest with you.
I think that wild animal suffering is a refutation of utilitarianism. So,
How so?
well, I used to be a very, very doctrinaire believer in libertarian rights theory. Have you heard of this?
Would that be like a Nozick position?
Yes. So,
Okay.
the idea is that people have rights to life, liberty, and property, and
Hmm.
the sum of morality is respecting other people's rights to those things. I don't know if there's a lot of academic philosophy literature on it. I've only seen the phrase libertarian rights theory in an offhand sentence from Michael Huemer, but it is something that a lot of ordinary people believe. If you go to libertarian conventions, you'll find lots and lots of people who this is their moral framework. And the Libertarian Party gets more than 1% in every election, and many more people would vote for them if they thought they had a chance of winning.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like it is a substantial number of non-academics. It's a substantial number of like regular people who believe in this. I still think it's the most compelling theory. I still basically believe in it, but I would add the qualifier that I think you could do whatever you want as long as you respect other people's rights. But I also think there are right and wrong things to want. So I think that the most important moral commandments are these side constraints of not aggressing against other people. But then in addition to that, it's not good to spend all of your life like playing video games and watching porn and eating Cheetos in a basement, like just wasting your life away. It's good to live life to the fullest, and so there's a virtue
100%.
component there as well. But
Yeah,
I'd
I
also
saw.
go ahead.
Sorry, I saw what you wrote. Something you wrote a while ago about classical liberalism is great as a sort of first step. Respect these things, but then it doesn't then tell you what you should do afterwards. There's less kind of
Right.
pro, which I like. I like as a. Although I want to push back on the idea that it's such an obvious common sense that there's this kind of libertarian framing. Because I'm British, as you can tell. In Britain, the consensus is very much not that in people's intuitions. People have very statist intuitions, a lot of which I disagree with, but people really do. Like, it is a minority opinion to think that people should be free to offend other people in Britain. And I'm in Germany at the moment. There's a minority opinion in Germany. And personally, I
Yeah, that's a recent development, though.
But it is still true that this is and we've had censorship many times before,
right? Well,
in times of conflict.
Let's discuss this in a moment. I want to say though, I think I said it. I think I claimed it was obvious that meaning is very important. I don't know if I claimed that libertarianism being the true moral theory is necessarily obvious. I think it's true, though I'm not sure if it's obvious.
Sure.
Now, with regards to modern Western Europeans' attitudes on a lot of this stuff, I mean, there has, since World War II, there's been a gigantic campaign of propaganda to mold people's opinions. I don't want to get into all the details there, but there's the current system, which people in America and especially in Western Europe are sent through, would have been the envy of Goebbels and the Soviets. They get people when they're 6 years old and send them to these these schools where they spend 8 hours a day until they're 18. And you also have Hollywood and Netflix. You have an unlimited, you have more hours of propaganda than you could ever watch in a single lifetime streamed to you to a device in your pocket 24/7. So I think that I think that people's moral intuitions in the pre-1950 era are going to be a lot more reliable than the current ones, because the current ones are subjected to this reality distorting propaganda system that didn't exist for nearly all of human history. All that being said, I do think that a lot of people do have very libertarian moral intuitions. And to give you one example, there's a part of the Old Testament, I think in the book of Genesis. So this is one of the oldest documents that has ever been written that we have. Mm-hmm. They talk about, is it Joseph or is it Joshua? I think it's Joseph. He's sold into slavery by his brothers to the Pharaoh of Egypt. And then his brothers think they killed him, but then he's sold into slavery to the Pharaoh of Egypt, and then he becomes an advisor. And then he has a dream where he predicts that there's going to be where God tells him there's going to be a famine. And so then he goes to the Pharaoh and says, hey, you should buy up all the grain now and become like a grain speculator. So he hoards all the grain, and then when there's a famine, it's very valuable. And so the people come to the Pharaoh and they say, we'll sell you all of our property in exchange for this grain because we don't want to starve. So he sells them the grain. But then after a few years, there's still a famine, and the people come to him and say, okay, we're selling ourselves into slavery because we have nothing else, but we still want to survive. So everyone in Egypt sells themselves into slavery to the Pharaoh. And then in Genesis, it says, and this is why to this day, everyone in Egypt pays a 7% tax to the Pharaoh because because technically they're all his slaves and they're working his land that he owns. So this is an explanation that taxation could only be justified if the person you're paying taxes to like owns your body and owns your land, which implies that the default state is that if nobody owns you and nobody owns the land you're working on, then you don't owe them any taxes.
Yeah, I think, I mean, you said a lot. You've given me a lot of pause for thought. I would say I take the point with the propaganda post World War II to adopt certain positions, but I also think many European states had communitarian instincts prior to World War II. Like if you look at Germany or if you look at Britain, Britain was the origin of kind of Anglo-Saxon libertarianism in some ways, and we still suspended habeas corpus under William Pitt the Younger. It was, these things were not held and did censorship at that time because of the French threat, and so there's never been. It's rare to find an absolutist commitment as being the majority opinion because of communitarian instincts as well. But,
I agree, but I don't think
yeah.
I'm bound to the claim that I don't think I'm bound to the claim that a majority of people hold an absolute commitment to libertarianism. And I'm not sure that I hold an absolute commitment to libertarianism either. I mean, it's there. You could think of cases like, would you murder one person to save 100 people? I think that's an interesting discussion. But the main point I want to make is that people's basic moral intuitions are like libertarian-ish. They'll make an exception if they're in the middle of a war or there's some other extreme circumstance. But the basic framework is that you should respect, but you should live your own life and respect other people's rights.
Yeah, I agree. I think that people have these sort of libertarian, communitarian like instincts that are in tension. But I agree that people do have a libertarian instinct. And I
also don't think community is in tension with libertarianism. The libertarian position is that there should be voluntary communities, and you would voluntarily sign up for one. And if you're born into a community that you don't like, then you can leave and go try to find somewhere else.
But people do have, let's say, collectivist instincts as well, where they want to impose on others. Perhaps that's.
Can you give me an example?
Well, I mean, I think if I give you examples, then you'll try and claim that they're peculiar, and I will.
Maybe so. Just give me one anyway.
But I think like suspension of habeas corpus is one. And in the past 20 years, people have been scared about terror attacks, and so they say, okay, let's extend detention without trial, and that was also the case 200 years ago. And at intermittent periods, people have said that when we're scared, let's surrender that, and that's an imposition on people without there being necessarily strong evidence to impose that the person's done anything that warrants a restriction on their rights, right?
Right. So habeas corpus is a procedural thing about how to deal with people who've been accused of rights violations but have not been proven to have violated rights.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just think that during a war or when people are afraid of terror attacks, they're going to be willing to make exceptions. I still think that libertarian rights theory I think it's correct, and I also think it lines up with what most people basically believe.
I don't think we disagree as much as my disagreement implies, because I do think people have this instinct, and I think that it's very strong in a lot of people, and I think it's a good instinct for people to have, and it creates more prosperous societies when a lot of people have this instinct. But I just also think that people who gear more towards, for example, the neurotic end, are going to therefore be more easily freaked out and be more keen to embrace the collectivistic exception a lot of the time, and therefore not be
That's
very
probably true.
libertarian in that in the end. And so I think it's worth being cognizant of that anyway. But I'm sure, yeah, as I'm sure libertarians are on the whole. I
Well,
also wanted
I want to talk about wild animal suffering. So I
do you
think
mind
that
if
the
I push
correct,
back on property and then we talk about that?
sure, go
Because
ahead.
I thought there was something really interesting with the when you were talking about Egypt, and this is the point in which I agree with you, because you were saying, hey, people have this libertarian instinct, and this relates to property and taxation, and why did the ancient Egyptians government even have the right to tax? And I guess a lot of the claims of people more on the left is not to deny that people would have a right to some sort of possession, but simply to deny that most of property today is like true possession in some fundamental right sense. Is to say, well, hey, actually, this property that you have is theft, or this property, if not theft, it's kind of illegitimate, and then you can justify. And it seems interesting that a lot of the debate is fought on those grounds.
Yeah, I think that most left wing opinion, I think most of like, I'm not talking about the center left people, but most like left wing opinions, I think are just a cover for malice. I think they just want to hurt other people, and they kind of make up an ideological excuse around it. But
I think
maybe that's a topic
extreme
for another day.
people, yeah, I think extreme people, but I guess like a centrist who's trying to advocate
I
of
think
a
it's,
slightly
well, I don't know
broader.
what you mean by extreme. Did you read what Michael Huemer wrote about Queers for Palestine?
I don't think so.
So he was writing this article to, thinking about the psychology of the Queers for Palestine people. And his conclusion, which I think is totally the correct one, is that it's really just about hatred of America and white people. And Israelis are perceived to be white. I mean, most of them actually are of Middle Eastern origin, but the ruling class is more Ashkenazi. Israel is perceived as the more white side. If they were really about gay rights, they would not be pro-Islam. That really would not make any sense. And if they were really about, being concerned about people in the third world being killed, then maybe they'd be concerned about Gaza, but they would also be concerned about Ethiopia and the war in the Congo and a bunch of other places where people are being killed. The reason why there's such a huge focus on Israel is just because of racial animus, because there are Middle Eastern people who sympathize with their co-racialists against Jewish aggression, and because there are, or alleged Jewish aggression, and because there are like misanthropes in the West who dislike white people and associate Israel with white people. I think that's the real motivation there.
Yeah, or it fits into a like colonist narrative. Yeah.
But I think the colonist narrative is purely about misanthropy and racial solidarity. I think there are like fewer than 5 sincere anti-colonialists on Earth.
No, I disagree. I think people buy their own Kool-Aid. Who wants to be the bad guy who's like putting on a front?
But there are like neo-Nazi skinheads who buy their own Kool-Aid. I mean, everyone's going to tell themselves a story where they're the good guy. But I think there are still cases where people are very obviously intentionally fudging the story to justify some other motivation.
I think, but particularly when you're like a teenager and you're discussing these things, it's very nice. It has a great appeal to be like, hey, here is a certain view of what's good and what's bad. you can very easily jump on certain things and say this is the bad, and really believe in that as your state of being. And that because nowadays loads of people live in like this extended adolescence, they're 30 years old and they don't have family. They're 40 years old, they don't have family. And also, obviously, I'm not saying that you need to have family in order to end the state of adolescence, but it's probably harder to end the state of adolescence without having family, right? Without starting your own family. And so because of that, it's very tempting to just stay in that way of thinking. And that
But
way
I think that's a separate thing. I don't think that the
to,
reason why people believe in colonialist stuff is related to adolescence. It's not just that, there are lots of
yeah.
accounts of what's good and what's bad, like libertarianism or utilitarianism.
Yeah, for sure. But I think when you're not having to deal with full nuances and like actually like making decisions of consequence, then it's very tempting to stick on a label for certain things and go, if something fits this category, then it's bad. And that's simple. And then if there's a narrative going around of anything that smacks of colonialism, even if it dates back 80 years, bad. And to reason,
But
and
if
I
it's
think
just about having a satisfying narrative, why is there not a similar number of people who are worried about, like, I don't know, being worried about colonialism is so silly. Why aren't there a similar number of people who are worried about, like, seeming crass? Why do we not have a moral panic where everything remotely crass gets protested and canceled, and we have like sophistication activists like telling everyone what to do?
but we probably have had that in the past. I think, like temperance
Maybe.
movements are potentially a bit about that. I think I'm unfair to temperance movements because it's not just about that, right? It's also about antisocial behavior, etc. But it's partly about that. It's like, this is not respectable, so stop it. And there's outrage.
I agree. Certainly, whenever there's like a social panic, there are a lot of people who get on board just because they like the panic.
Yeah.
I think with colonialism, the seed of the panic was the misanthropy and racial solidarity that I was describing.
I think, yeah, I think partially, but I'm more charitable to the other position. I think that there's a lot of very just heartfelt, like, this is our idea of what's bad, and therefore, and most people aren't thinking about it in depth, but are still thinking about it on an abstract level.
What's the steelman version of the anti-colonial position?
I'm not even saying it needs to be come to in like a rational argumentation way. I'm just saying, if you absorb enough material which says anything colonialist, vaguely bad. I know I'm not speaking in a full sentence, but I think I don't think it's a full sentence forward. And then you can just fit things into that narrative. Because I think this is how I used to think as a teenager. I think for a while I was like, I read The Guardian when I was 13, and I'd be like, neoliberalism, that's the worst. And if I wanted to disparage something, I just go, that's so neoliberal, man. And bam, I've just shown that that's terrible. And that's how I thought. And I think the only way I think the only reason I moved past that is because I was actually interested enough in issues to carry on reading about them, read people who I then disagreed with, think about it. Actually, but if politics wasn't something that I was so passionate about, then I'd probably still be where I was at 13. Because it's just default thinking. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people are like that. Because why bother thinking about it more?
I'm sure that's true for a lot of people. I don't think that relates to Queers for Palestine, who presumably if they're activists, they care a substantial amount about politics.
Yes, although I don't know if people care. Like what is it that they care about? Because they probably care about being right in the sense of caring about feeling like they're on the right side and doing good, which, to be fair, is a
which is something people should care about.
it's exactly that's a worthy aim, but obviously you best realize that aim if you also care about being right as well as caring that you're feeling right and that you're doing the righteous thing. And you should also actually constantly reevaluate your priors. But I think a lot of activists, like if you want to be a successful activist, you want to not reevaluate your priors too much because you want to keep on the same track. And if you reevaluate your priors, well, you might change track. And that might not be helpful for the brand or the identity. So it might fit best to just read the things that we confirm and talk about them loads. And I'm sure that explains a lot of the behavior. But I agree with you that I also think a lot of people have misanthropic ideas. A lot of people have like self-hating motivations or whatever. There's a lot of perverse thinking that goes into this as well. But I wouldn't want to think that it was all perverse.
Well, I pulled up Humer's essay. I was going to read part of it, but it actually takes a while to get to the point, so maybe that's not a good use of time.
Oh, sure. Sure. But anyway, I'm very happy to. Sorry, what were you going to say?
We should post this conversation on a Substack, and I'll link to Humer's essay. We were talking about wild animal suffering.
Yes.
What were we talking about between wild animal suffering, and then you said you wanted to push back on the claim that political motivations are misanthropic. Did we miss anything?
Oh, well, I think I've pushed back on because I didn't want to push back on it totally, right? Like I accept that that's a problem. And a lot of people just have this very dim view of humanity or their own civilization or whatever. I accept that. And I accept that that's a problem and that that's a motivation. I just also think there are these worthy motivations as well.
Okay.
But yeah, I'm happy to go back to wild animal suffering. So you were saying it refutes utilitarianism. Did I get that right?
Yes. So on libertarianism, the account of the account of animal rights is pretty coherent. It's not about animal welfare; it's about animal rights. So obviously you don't have the right to like capture an adult and lock them in your basement and torture them. That's a violation of their rights. But torturing an adult is vastly different morally from merely failing to intervene while someone's being tortured. I mean, assuming the intervening is some kind of costly act, like you're not just standing right there. But if there's someone in another continent who's being, horribly mistreated, we know there are people out there being horribly mistreated right now, and we are not spending our time to go out there and stop it. But not intervening is obviously totally different from kidnapping someone and torturing them. Failing to save someone's life on another continent is very different morally from committing murder. And so with animals, I think that factory farming is wrong because you are actively doing the harm to the animal. But I don't think that wild animal suffering is something to be morally concerned about because you're not doing it to the animal. The animals are out there in nature, experiencing the slings and arrows of nature, and we are just not intervening. So that's an account. So the result of libertarianism is that factory farming is wrong, but you do not have an obligation to intervene in wild animal suffering, which I think is the intuitive position. The utilitarian position
is that we should intervene.
Is that you have to intervene, and potentially like wild animal suffering is the worst thing on earth and is worse than all genocides in human history, and is potentially even worse than factory farming. Maybe, I don't know what the calculations are on that.
Although I'd want to steel man it because I don't know why we have this, like, and obviously it's a huge debate in ethics, but I don't know why we have this, like, we do have this strong intuition that allowing is different from doing. But it's kind of funny why we have that intuition in the first place. And I feel like one way in which you could say we've got this intuition because often when we do things, we have unforeseen consequences. And so if we expect it to be good, we could also kind of expect there to be some regression to the mean of it not being good when we do an action, because there's a lot of noise
also
going
an
on.
opportunity cost.
Yeah, I think that's a great point as well. Yeah, so the opportunity cost of what else could you be doing, and then also, if you're intervening in a dynamic system, you don't know the full effects, so it's likely that the magnitude of the effect is less in the positive direction than you think. And then once you're adding in that uncertainty, then you could come up with a sort of utilitarian, like a broad strokes utilitarian justification for why there's this distinction, which is nothing to do with the hypothetical result per se, but is saying there's a lower probability of getting the positive result and therefore a lower expected value if you're talking about actively intervening to achieve it.
Another factor might be that libertarian rights theory is the correct moral theory.
Yes, yeah, no, of course. And I agree that the situation should raise your credence level in that conclusion. But I think the steel man of utilitarianism means that it's not quite a knockout punch. I'm not actually a utilitarian, but I just think that the thought experiment is not a knockout punch for utilitarianism, because I think you can kind of salvage this utilitarian defense of holding this principle as a sort of heuristic to help
I think you could definitely salvage holding as a heuristic, but it seems like you can make the number of wild animals or farmed animals, you can make the number of wild animals arbitrarily large so that it outweighs every other concern. And then it turns out that the only thing that anyone should be doing is destroying nature so that fewer animals are born.
Yeah. And this is why we need capitalism to expand and domesticate all the land.
So that's kind of
growing population to go out. Yeah. And obviously annexing Greenland will be a great part of this, because then you can
that would be exciting.
Go out and expand across. Although to be fair, there's probably not that many wild animals in Greenland, so maybe that doesn't fit. But anyway.
Yeah, I believe almost the entire island is covered by a glacier. So there's and the Arctic has a very low number of animals anyway.
Yeah, but you should free the ice, obviously.
Free the ice?
Free the ice, yeah. Because right now the tyrannical Danish control is oppressing the ice. And so
right.
You need to come in and liberate the ice.
Did you know there's more, the ice sheet in Greenland contains far more fresh water than in all the lakes and rivers on Earth?
I didn't know that. Are you going to build a pipeline from Greenland down to California?
That would be extraordinary. That would be an extraordinary feat of engineering. You would also have to have the energy to melt that much ice, which would be, I think, beyond humanity's entire energy generating capacity.
I think it's great. I think what we'd do is just create a hyperlink from Greenland to California, right?
Mm-hmm.
And obviously the technology is already there because we're told that it's there. And then we create some kind of constellation around the Arctic that concentrates the solar rays of the sun, like a sort of giant satellite.
Have you ever watched Isaac Arthur's YouTube channel?
I've not.
It's great. So he talks about a lot of science fiction concepts, mostly for space, building giant things in space. But he also talks about building giant things on Earth for something like what you're describing.
Right.
So
I think I've solved climate change as well.
What's that?
I think I've just solved climate change as well.
I think so. Yeah. There's a proposal to spray sulfur dioxide in the stratosphere because, CO2, it allows light through, but then it traps the heat. But there's some, so that's a greenhouse gas, but there are some anti-greenhouse gases that reflect some of the light. And so if you spray sulfur dioxide is one of them. If you sprayed sulfur dioxide in the very high atmosphere, it would reflect a tiny amount of the sun's light outward. And so that would reduce the amount of sunlight reaching Earth's surface, which would reduce global warming. Yeah,
I read your piece on that, which I thought was really exciting. And what did you say? It would cost just a few billion USD a year.
Yes, I heard
Is that
about this
right?
from, I think, Robin Hanson, who
Right.
is an econ professor also at GMU. And
Mhm.
yeah, apparently it would be, I think, at most $10 billion a year, which is a tiny amount of money compared to the
Yeah,
alternative.
it's incredible. But I guess my only concern is what the and I mean certainly if we were in a state of like runaway climate change, then I imagine it would be worth doing. But what's the air pollution cost on that?
Well, so I think sulfur dioxide can cause acid rains, but if I understand it correctly, the amount that you would need to put in the atmosphere is lower than the amount that's released naturally from volcanoes every year.
Hmm.
So there's currently some sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere from volcanoes, which reflects a little bit of sunlight, but the volcanoes are not optimized to cool off the earth. They're just spewing out a bunch of sulfur dioxide.
Yeah, yeah.
So if we took a much smaller amount of sulfur dioxide and sprayed it strategically, like up in the stratosphere at the most optimal place, then you would get a lot more effect for a smaller quantity. So it would not be a huge increase in the overall levels of sulfur dioxide. And it would be possible to put to put some kind of giant filters around volcanoes to suck out some of their sulfur dioxide if you wanted to.
Right, right. How would that work though? Giant filters. There'd be a bit of a risk of them being blown off in the extreme cases, I imagine.
No, 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 no.
I
Volcanoes are
guess
only erupting for a very, very tiny percentage of the time of their existence.
yeah, I guess if you just did it over the ones that were just doing magma flows, then you could
No, but it's
collect.
not from magma flows. I think it's from. Oh, you're saying sulfur dioxide is only emitted when they erupt. You might be right. I'm not sure. I don't
Yeah, I think
know.
that's when that mostly is. Yeah.
That's probably what it mostly is. Yeah,
Uh,
I'd have to look it up.
it's cool.
If there are continuous flows, which I think there are in some places,
Mm.
it would probably be more effective. It would be similar to the machines they use to suck carbon dioxide out of the air.
Right, right, right. So you could just okay. That's really cool. So you could potentially even reduce localized emissions.
Yes. Well,
Yeah, and if there was more of an effort,
for CO2, it would be prohibitively expensive.
yeah. And I guess there's a lot of sulfur dioxide from like industrial processes in developing countries. So if you also ramped up trying to capture that at the same time,
Capture the sulfur dioxide or the carbon dioxide?
the sulfur dioxide. So then the like on net. So you're placing it at the top of the atmosphere, but you're trying to reduce emissions on surface. So
Right.
then you could potentially be doing the geoengineering scheme at the same time as reducing the air pollution level on Earth, assuming that you have the incentives right.
The incentives are definitely the trickiest thing
Yeah.
because you don't want, like, would we really want China to control the entire global climate and have the power to trigger an ice age? Probably not.
I don't see any problems.
You see no problems? You think they would do a good
No,
job?
no problems. Yeah, well, I think obviously China has the global interest at heart. So, I mean, this is
I
kind of
mean, any
we
kind of
need to get
disaster
it out of the
China
hands of the
causes anyone
evil.
else. So
Sorry,
maybe the incentives would be aligned.
sorry, what was that?
Oh, I said any kind of disaster from doing this the wrong way would affect China as much as anyone else. So maybe the incentives would be aligned.
I suppose, although I suppose probably less than play. Like if you looked at dramatic cooling or dramatic warming, in both cases, China would probably not be the most exposed country.
Well, yeah, I guess it wouldn't be the most exposed, but it would certainly be very bad for China for some kind
Yeah,
of ice age to occur.
yeah, probably not cool. Yeah, no, I think it's a really cool idea, and definitely puts the whole thing in a different perspective. Because I guess the debate when we're talking about innovation is always limited by, okay, sure, well maybe we'll innovate our way out of this problem, but until you do, how can we be sure? But so then it's kind of cool of like, well, here we have a ready intervention
Right.
that could act. So then you can relax a bit, guys. But yeah, that's interesting. I'm going on. Do you know the deep left analysis guy?
Yes, I did a podcast with him
Oh, cool.
months ago.
Oh, okay. I should look that up. So I'm going on him later today, and I noticed this is a slight segue. So cut me off if you don't feel this is fruitful.
Go ahead.
But I saw a comment from him saying, like, oh, he doesn't like the pronatalist stuff because there's an emphasis on, and I hope I'm summarizing him correctly. He feels there's an emphasis on quantity over quality. And how are you making sure that the human lives are worthwhile and that they're actually going to be productive, and actually going to be contributing to the world? But for me, because I'm, as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm quite pronatalist count, and I'm just generally quite positive on the whole human life thing, and so. But I was just reminded because of the debate on climate change and the whole kind of environment and trade-offs, and how much will increasing population increase innovation, which will then help long-run growth. But obviously there is capital dilution and like less land to go around as you increase.
I don't think that the quantity over quality objection is a good objection to pronatalism.
Okay.
Because for one thing, pronatalists are generally talking about increasing the birth rates among like the most well-educated people in the highest income countries, rather than just
I mean,
everywhere else. So I think they're already aware of quantity versus quality issues.
I mean, it depends, because there's also the argument of like just generally help people have kids. So just close the gap between people's desires and the number they have, which is less discriminatory on things like productive potential. But yeah, the whole thing is an interesting kind of, because even if you do focus on productive people, it's still an interesting optimization problem. Like, how do you know that you're actually creating that long? And I'm quite positive on the whole thing, because I think we've got capacity, but it's still an interesting. I'm still interested in the counterfeit, but I don't know if I have that. I didn't really want to steel man it too much, because I do think it fails ultimately. So the count. Maybe I'll discuss that with him later. Can I ask you a question, by the way? I know I'm being a bit, I don't know, spontaneous in my musings, but I'm wondering, because when I read your pieces, I get a very kind of Aristotelian sense in a lot of ways. Like you care about eudaimonia and the good life, and your pieces on sport and drugs really speak to that. But then in our discussion today, you're talking a lot about these kind of like libertarian essentials, which almost speak to a more sort of deontic mindset. I was just wondering how you synthesize these. I'm not saying there's a contradiction.
I have not read much Aristotle.
Okay.
I did talk about eudaimonia. I did talk about sport, though I said I was against it. I don't know Aristotle's position on sport.
Oh yeah, so he's more in favor of like the physical virtue, but I meant more like the kernel of what he's saying. Like as in the virtue ethics kernel.
Okay.
Like, we want to be in pursuit of this kind of human excellence.
Well, that goes back to my moral theory, that I think that, yes, I'm a deontologist about, or roughly a deontologist about libertarian rights. And I think you should do what, I think you can do whatever you want, provided you're not violating other people's rights. But I also think that there are some things that are better to want than others. So I think it's good to live a eudaimonic life within the side constraints of not attacking other people. And I think that living a eudaimonic life is just obviously better than like being a crack addict
Or a sports addict.
or a sports addict. Yes.
Very good. But it's okay to pop a couple mushrooms.
It's probably what?
Okay to pop a couple mushrooms.
Yes, I do think so.
But how does that
hallucinogen exploration is a good thing, and I think it's different in kind from. I mean, I have not used crack, so I guess I don't know from firsthand experience. But it seems like there are some drugs that people really are just using to make themselves feel good as a substitute for having good moods, and I think that hallucinogens are categorically different than that.
Yeah. But I still. So I know you use it's like exploration is kind of the analogy.
Yes.
But it's not like how do you know what you're exploring when
What
you
do you
take when you take a hallucinogenic drug? Because if you're saying this is analogous to like maybe a frontier mindset, or maybe not even that, just maybe just a curious mindset, and that it feels good for us to indulge our instinct for curiosity. And I'm like, cool. But how do you know when you're taking a drug that you're actually exploring anything?
Well, you're not exploring anything out in the physical world, but you are having a novel experience. Like if you read about the experiences of, if you read a big book of people who had all kinds of experiences, like going to another country or exploring a jungle or taking LSD, first, you can't even imagine what taking LSD is like if you do not do it.
Mm-hmm.
And also it's, if you have never taken LSD and then you take it, you are exploring a new experience, even though it's not something outside of your head.
Yeah, I get that, but how do you know that that's I guess I'm just struggling with how you then demonstrate that that's virtuous if it's kind of unclear what what endeavor, like typically an exploration has kind of an endeavor at the end of it. So
maybe exploration isn't the right word then, because you're right, it is not purposeful. Like it's not like it's a quest where you have some goal, but it does come from curiosity, and you're exploring something, you are having this new experience. You're like exploring the full range of human experience if you do things like that.
But then could you not argue that it risks being a perversion if it is the case that, hey, we have this curiosity for a given end and you're
I see what you're saying,
using it to that end?
Well, yeah, I see how you could make that argument if you thought curiosity was solely for the purpose of discovering things, or like solely for the purpose of acquiring new resources. But I think that curiosity is good even apart from that. I mean, for one thing, if acquiring resources and surviving were the only goal, then we could just plug ourselves into IVs and like not live and not have any experiences. But that obviously would not be good. So I think that exploring the full range of human experience is good, even when it doesn't provide any tangible benefit.
I can see the argument for that, but then I can't help but feel that by analogy I would then say that sport is cool because we have an impulse for like team battle, and that's also physically and mentally challenging.
I think if there were some society where nobody had ever played sports and then people like found ancient book that described sports, and they recreated sports and started sports again, I think that would be a good thing to do maybe a few times in moderation. But in our present society, there's just basically no one who uses sports in moderation. It's people who play sports, it's like a part-time job between all of their practices and all of their games, and then watching other people play sports. And worst of all, nearly everyone who defends sports playing tries to make it into something more grandiose than it is. There's basically no one who will say, "Oh yeah, sports are just like this hobby." They'll say, "Oh, sports are what life is really about, and it's the only way you can learn about teams." And it's like every person should do sports. If you push back on sports even a little bit, you'll get that kind of response from basically everyone who claims to use sports in moderation. So I agree in principle that I actually agree in principle that sports use in moderation would be a good thing. But it so happens that in our society, basically none of the sports people are actually using it in moderation.
Sure. So if we used it in a sort of public school sense of let's instill certain virtues through sports. Like,
well,
hey, we want
I don't love that either, because I don't like it when people try to make something into something more profound than it really is.
Okay.
I would be okay with people just having like a pickup game of like pickup football every now and then. I think that would be fine. Maybe that would be better than fine. Maybe it would be good. But in practice, sports are this gigantic multi-billion-dollar industry where people sit on their couch and get really emotionally invested in these other guys playing with the ball 1,000 miles away.
But I still can't help but push back on them analogizing this to psychedelics, because well, like,
you mean push back because you are analogizing it to psychedelics, right?
Well, yeah, I am. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
But so it's then like, well, hey, yeah, sorry, I was too British about that. I was I can't help but feel like I should analogize this instead of the.
You said push back on, so I thought that meant pushing back against, but I think we
clarified. Okay. Yeah, I should have said push back using one. Yes. Quite right. Because in the case of the curious, like you're indulging this instinct for curiosity, not necessarily to any apparent broader end. And it's the same with a sports game, that you're indulging these probably evolved instincts regarding like activity that is also physically and mentally demanding, or at least like processing speed demanding, perhaps, with a lot of games. And is also, I can't remember what I've said, but yet the team and the physical and the mental. And there seems to be something about this combination which is very satisfying. But you're just then adopting it as an end in itself. But so it seems like if that's a perversion, then the other thing should also be.
Well, I think I talked about perversion in my essay about drug use and Diet Coke and sexual ethics. That's that's the essay where I was talking about perversion. And where I was talking about sports was a different essay. I don't think I used the term perversion in that one. I would not make the argument that sports are necessarily a perversion of the faculties. Okay. I think that they're a vice because in practice they're always taken to excess. And because
and it would also be excess if somebody took LSD every night and said,
so there are some, I mean, I don't even know how many of these people exist anymore, but there's the stereotype of like the hippie whose whole life is LSD and he thinks it's like the most profound thing ever, and he's always telling everyone that they need to take LSD all the time. That's also bad. He's not he's not doing it in moderation. That's a bad way to live. I mean, it's like that's like as bad as being a sports watcher. But yeah, so it just so happens that as far as I'm aware today, there are many people who like do psychedelics a few times in college and then do not have it become their entire personality. I don't see the same thing with sports at all. With sports, it does seem like it's a double-digit number of hours per week for everyone who's involved in it, plus lots of time sitting on the couch, and then it like becomes their whole identity when they're an adult. or it becomes
Yeah,
at least.
I see the joke.
Even if it
with
doesn't become their
the-
whole identity, they get way too emotionally involved in it.
Yeah, no, for sure. There's the joke of the guy who is also drinking a bit too much, and it's like, well, why are you drinking tonight? It's like, well, it's Monday Night Football. I got a drink, and then on the Tuesday, why are you drinking? There's no Monday Night Football. You got to mourn it. And yeah, but anyway, I think that's funny. But I guess so. Then there's still a case for like moderation. Like I don't watch football, but we had the Euros last summer, and the one football match that I watched, or maybe it was two, sorry, but one of the very few occasions I watched a football match last year was the Euros final, where England was in it, and I went round my aunt's, and we had some beers and some whiskeys and a barbecue, and it was like a nice thing. It was a social thing while also watching, and that felt like that was still kind of productive. And it was using alcohol in a Simon approved
It
social
is.
setting.
Yes, I do approve of social alcohol use. So yeah, I think that if the sports game facilitated your social interaction, maybe that's nice. I think that there are probably other things you could have done. Well, I don't know. Maybe your family is into sports, but yeah, I think that having a social event with family where you have a sports game on in the background is very different from most people's sports. And for most sports people, it's very different from their involvement.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it makes sense that it would be unhealthy if it becomes the end in and of itself. And that there must be something unsatisfying about also just always being an observer in it. If that's the path
Yes.
you take.
Yeah, watching sports is definitely even worse than playing sports all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
What did you think about my thoughts on Diet Coke?
So let me get you right on this. So you were saying some people make the argument that Diet Coke is bad because it's empty calories and you should drink for sustenance. And you're saying it's bad because it titillates the taste without
Yes.
actually representing the good that taste represents. If you see what I mean, without actually
Something like that.
containing the good that taste
Yeah.
indicates.
Yeah. So did you read the post by Amos Wallen that I was responding to?
No.
Okay. Well, he was writing about natural law theorists, and I'll just summarize it. So there are these people, nearly all of them Catholics, who say that the right moral theory is something called natural law. And on natural law, it's the idea is that you have faculties or powers or whatever you call them, and you should do those faculties as towards their intended purpose. A purpose also is called a telos, and it is morally wrong. And I think they would say you are never ever ever allowed to use a faculty for something other than its proper purpose. So they say that homosexuality is always wrong because the purpose of sexuality is for reproduction and bonding, but it can only be bonding between a married heterosexual couple. And masturbation is also wrong on that account because it's using sexuality for a non-reproductive purpose. So there's a challenge to people who hold that view that Diet Coke and sugarless gum also don't provide any nutrition. And it would seem like the purpose of chewing and drinking is sustenance, but you're not getting any sustenance from Diet Coke or sugarless gum. So when I read Amos's piece, initially I was confused by why he said Diet Coke and sugarless gum. I thought he was talking about something related to the artificial sweeteners, but I guess it's not. He was just picking two things that happen to have 0 calories.
Right. Yeah.
And there's also, I guess there's also an idea that the caffeine in Diet Coke will dehydrate you by more than the amount of the water in Diet Coke. And that happens not to be true. That's not true. It's not true.
Okay.
That was part of the idea from John Corvino, who is one of the people who proposed the Diet Coke objection to natural law theory. I took a different tack. I think that there's something to be said for natural law. I think that the natural law moral concerns are less important than the libertarian rights, which I think are hard side constraints. But I think the natural law has something to do with living a eudaimonic life and virtue, like spending all of your time in a basement masturbating and eating Cheetos and like sleeping odd hours and playing video games. That seems like it's a bad life, and the badness could be explained in terms of contravening your natural functions of going out and being a human in the real world. So, but if I were to defend natural law theory, I think you can just bite the bullet and say that Diet Coke is bad, because Diet Coke contains an artificial sweetener, and sugarless gum, I mean, nearly all sugarless gum also contains artificial sweeteners to make it sweet. And I think that there is something morally suspicious about stimulating the pleasure circuitry of sweetness with an artificial thing. And if it sounds implausible to you, imagine that you have this like beaker of flavor chemical that mimics the flavor of a very delicious meal. Could you just like strap yourself to an IV and get all your nutrition by IV, but then drop these flavor chemicals on your tongue and just pretend that you were eating? That seems bad. It seems less than ideal to be inside just taking these drops of chemicals on your tongue. And Diet Coke is very far removed from that, but I think Diet Coke is the first step on that road.
And therefore not cool.
Exactly. And to prove I'm not just making up this intuition, I actually never had artificial sweetener soda growing up because my parents just thought it was unhealthy and they preferred natural foods. And as an adult, I discovered that I get violently ill from sucralose and some other artificial sweeteners. So I don't avoid. I totally avoid things with artificial sweeteners in them. So it's not any cost to me to have this anti-artificial sweeteners. Mm-hmm. But also, I have been avoiding them for my entire life. So it's not like I'm just making up this idea that artificial sweeteners are bad on the spot. And I admit that I kind of, for the purpose of writing things on Substack, I was kind of playing up my anti-sports and anti-Diet Coke position. But I do also hold them. I do think that sports are a vice, and I think artificial sweeteners should probably be morally avoided.
Sure. Yeah, but why not? Why not play it up in the moment, I suppose. I think that the intuition on the sweetener, since you asked what I think it depends on your priors, because I can imagine a lot of people who would just say, I don't see a problem with that.
Mm-hmm.
Which I suppose it's a disenchantment of food. In the same way that perhaps 70 years ago, when speaking about sex, it would seem weird to detach totally like human interaction from sexual pleasure completely. But now there is the whole
interaction entirely. Are you talking about like pornography or something else?
Yeah, well, I think so. Well, because 70 years ago, like people attitudes generally weren't pro masturbation, although right. I'm sure it happened.
I think that, and I'm writing something else now. I think that their motivation for holding that opinion was actually not natural law. I think it was something else. But I will.
Yeah, sure.
Writing more about that now.
But also, it seems like presumably people would fantasize about real human interactions or whatever, when they were masturbating, generally on the whole. And then there was just actual human sex. Whereas now, with like AI porn and sex dolls, like we're getting more and more dissociating any human interaction from sexual pleasure. And the more that we do that, the less that feels odd. Like we've already come a long way in a sort of disenchantment journey. And so I guess one thing you could say is with the food and with like the the sustenance and taste example is perhaps there's an analogous disenchantment, and then the question is the fact that we're having this disenchantment bad? Like, are we falling away from something? Or the alternative would be where we had this illusion of associating them as like a fundamental thing because that's how it happened to evolve. But we can live thriving lives that are just as thriving with them dissociated, even though their origin is tied together. Like the taste is actually tied to the sustenance in terms of how we've used that for survival, and the sex to the interpersonal. I'm sure. I'm not sure. Was I sound?
I think we're on the right track. Yeah. So to build more, in case someone really just doesn't agree. Of course, there are going to be a lot of people who just think it's ridiculous to say that there's something morally wrong with Diet Coke. But I have two responses to the challenge that's ridiculous. One is what I said about, I think many people would agree that strapping yourself to an IV and taking flavor chemicals seems bad. And so there's a range, there's just a difference of degree between Diet Coke and that. And the other is that whenever people really get in trouble, it's often because they're doing something that's pleasurable for its own sake. So becoming a meth addict, people become meth addicts because they start just using meth purely recreationally. There's no other end that's served by taking meth. It's a pure recreational activity. I think even like if someone spends way too much time playing video games, they start doing this activity that's just for pleasure and is not pursuing any other higher purpose, or I shouldn't say higher purpose. It's not pursuing any practical purpose. Nothing that furthers their life and makes them flourish more in any way.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like we have the ability to experience pleasure because doing the thing that makes you experience pleasure is part of something that's good for you. But then we have these ways to hack the system and then just get the pleasure and isolate it and just do it by itself. And it seems like it certainly is very risky because you risk just getting so focused on this pleasurable activity that you forget to be productive. And it's also because the view against pleasure for its own sake is not that you never have fun, it's that you have fun incidentally in the process of pursuing your natural functions. So it's not wrong to have sexual pleasure, but you should have it, but it's like incidental. It's like you are living a good life and getting married and bonding with this other person and having children, and the sexual pleasure is incidental to that. Or you are eating this food that nourishes your body and the pleasure of taste is incidental to that. Or you are doing some kind of challenging work that's fun, and the fun that you have is like the fun and challenge is kind of incidental to your broader ambition. But then things like masturbation and junk food and video games are like counterfeits that just give you the pleasure of sex and food and challenge without doing the whole process.
Yeah.
And I think that Diet Coke is something like that. Artificial sweeteners or something like that, I think.
Yeah. And so it's at least prudentially bad.
Yes.
Yeah. I like that. So you could say like, man, you're just like dopamine maxing with this. With the
what's another one? Social media. Yeah. I think social media, like scrolling, gives people a big dopamine hit, but it's not even enjoyable. It's just like.
So I tell you something that I do that you may decide is unhealthy. But let's say I've got really boring work to do. So let's say I'm doing loads of like admin work. It's like repeat emails, repeat reports, entering things into a spreadsheet, that sort of stuff, like quite mind numbing. I will I will often listen to music and play a podcast or play shorts or play a
While you're
thing
doing the work.
at the same, and yeah, and I will play
Yeah,
the
I do
music
that
and
too.
the short
I'm
at
not
the
sure
same
if that's a
time.
good practice. I think maybe it scrambles your brain a bit.
I think it does, but I think it's also it's kind of cool and it keeps you in it. And then I'll max coffee, and it's kind of, but I honestly think I'm often, so I think you can overdo it, and then if it ends up distracting you, because often it does, right? Often you end up just watching the thing for like a minute, and then you're like, oh no, let me get back to it, and you do that like 10 times in 2 hours, and that's probably not good. But in the you're making it easier to do the work in that sense, so that the possibility of like switching off from boredom, the probability of switching off from boredom is lower
Mm-hmm.
as well. So in that sense, that feels like a sort of hack
Maybe
that's constructive.
it
But
might be. Yeah,
then
I would probably
could I
love to
use
see
Diet
some.
Coke as one of my stimuli?
But how does Diet Coke help you do anything?
Well, I just get this like sugary sugary feeling, uh, caffeine hit. But then I guess I'm doing it for the caffeine. So then maybe that undercuts the
Yeah,
point. Maybe you would make the exception for the caffeine. Yeah.
I guess I'll make the exception for the caffeine.
But maybe like a caffeine-free Diet Coke would still seem like kind of not relevant to what I'm doing. Yeah.
Yeah, so it also seems like there are better options. Like surely there's
Yeah. Yeah.
you could drink just regular soda that has real sugar and also has caffeine, or you could drink coffee.
I love my coffee. Coffee's great. It's got the polyphenol things, I'm told. As you can
Oh,
see
that
from
is.
me, I'm a real health hack. That's why I'm sat up so straight, and my muscles are bursting out of my jumper. And yeah, so coffee for the polyphenols. That's it. Stuff. Yeah. No, yeah, I see the point. As to why it would seem to be surplus to requirements.
What
Um,
requirements?
well, as in it's not being useful. Um, but I guess maybe you could say, well, hey, it's adding to making it a more enjoyable experience, which then makes it easier to focus. And so then let's say you had a craving for, I actually want a soda-y thing. Then maybe, but I feel like I'm putting a very high standard on you for this. I'm really trying to stress test this.
And I think I would be open to it if it was part of some other experience. Like I said, I think alcohol use is fine for a social experience.
Yeah.
It's hard for me to think of a real life case where you need Diet Coke to do the experience in the same way that you really do need alcohol for certain kinds of social experiences.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. No, it's a complicated one. Although there was one time I was losing weight because I weighed too much. As Boris Johnson once said, my friends, I was too fat back in turn of 2022 to 23. And so it's 2 years ago. And so I did a huge calorie cut early 2023. And it was like what the doctors would say is not advisable. But I'm still here. So who's
All
laughing?
right. Congratulations.
And yeah, and it was grand. And so I would be out with my little cherry Pepsi, like a man, on the with the pub, and that's so that I was still having a drink with a friend while I'd be out discussing things while I was like really tired from my calorie cut. But at least I had my little Pepsi so that they didn't feel weird about having a beer.
Was it a Diet
And that,
Pepsi?
yes, or whatever it was, the max. Yeah, probably ghastly stuff, but I was having it anyway.
Yeah, I think that I think I did say with I don't think it's a hard prohibition on Diet Coke. I think that if it's
Right.
really helpful to your diet, that's fine. And I would even say, like personally, if I was stuck at a conference and like all the water fountains are broken and all the water bottles have been drank and the only thing that we have to drink all day is Diet Coke, I probably would drink Diet Coke.
You'd give in. Yeah.
Yes.
But I take your point. It would have been silly for me to have then gone, oh, well, I'm on a diet. So got through a liter of Diet Pepsi at home every day because I wanted it. That would have probably been a bit silly. I'd have been making excuses to myself.
Yes, I would not be using it in moderation. I think having it at the bar with your friend I think that's moderation.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I like the argument. I like the argument. I guess there's a risk of like optimizing too much for things. I guess that's my only worry at this point. Sorry, I'm really trying to like find any way. I don't know why this is my impulse, but I'm just throwing ideas back. I guess there's always the risk that you, but it's quite a nice rule, like all things in moderation, as a sort of
all things in moderation, but respect for other people's rights, not in moderation. I think you should be extremely strict about that.
Yeah, they don't take that. I think my great grandfather apparently really loved the phrase "all things in moderation, including moderation." Ha ha ha.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's a nice sentiment.
What do you think about the state? Do you think that taxation is theft?
Oh man. Well, I think it's a difficult one because I do also. So I think property rights are incredibly useful as an institution because it helps people trade and work out welfare, right? It allows market mechanisms to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And it's an institution which is a check on the power of any given executive of the day. The fact that people have these sorts of things where we say, okay, you own this and you own that. So in that sense, there's great utility in it. It's really cool. And I quite like a Lockean argument for possession. Right? Like if you've gone and made something, then sure, you own it. And if you then trade that thing for something that someone else made, then sure you've got that. But I guess I do still think like I don't know about saying most, but obviously a lot of property in the world at some point in the past was just expropriation. So how do you say that like property in the iteration that like ownership in the iteration that is recognized today represents some like true fundamental right? I'm not sure. I think I mostly like property rights on like utility grounds.
Mm-hmm. Well, new things are being created all the time. Even if it's just like a new coffee shop, somebody is working to build it. And then then it seems like they own the coffee shop. I agree that ancient fortunes are much more dubious, especially when it was an ancient fortune acquired by cutting people's heads off, which many of them are.
For sure. And then the argument is, well, hey, that created, like, you did this by mixing your capital with your efforts, but then the capital that you had to mix was not legit. So like, what proportion of that can we say is your true right? As it versus like, what do you owe to some like Saxon in the mud in Hastings or whatever?
Right.
In the case of Britain.
Well, wait a minute. In Britain, how many aristocratic fortunes stretch back that long?
Well, actually, quite a few. Nobility today is largely Norman, and people with Norman surnames are still richer than people with Saxon surnames in the UK today.
I did not know that.
But obviously, people argue over. Some people would say, well, that's just because the Normans are superior stock and whatever. But other people,
they probably are. I mean, I mean, if richer people are more likely to marry like healthy, beautiful Saxon women, which they probably were, then they would probably have. Yeah, I mean, they probably would have very healthy children. There's probably some
It's
genetic.
it's an interesting musing. But yeah, beside the point, I think fortunes do extend far back. But yeah,
And
it's an
even if
interesting question,
even
like,
if they
what
were
extent
genetically superior, I don't think that gives them a right to, to steal other people and cut their heads off. So just to be clear about my position as a libertarian.
Sure. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think that's
Do you have the source for the Norman versus Saxon surname thing? That's interesting.
yeah, I'll send it to you afterwards.
Thank you.
Because I'll have to look it up. But I'll find there was some study out a few years ago because my Guardian reading days came across it, of course, because it's systemic privilege or whatever. But
Norman privilege, yes.
no privilege, yeah.
Yes. Although they would say it's not. They probably wouldn't say it's systemic privilege. They'd probably say it's just inherited wealth, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and maybe you could even try and create some kind of social contract argument, and you could say, well, these Normans, they came over, and then they defended us, because then they were organizing the defense. So look at these great benevolent providers of a public good, and so really we owe them more than their estates when you think
Defense
about
against the Danes or someone else.
Oh well, I guess the other French people at that
Right.
point. Yeah. So maybe really after the Normans came and killed like half the people in northern England, really that was outweighed by then hundreds of years of defense, and obviously the taxes were owed as well for the defense. And so social contract wise, this is all fine and dandy.
Yeah, it seems like a canonical case of theft to me. If a bunch of guys with swords go somewhere where they're not wanted and then like kill half the people and take their gold, that
I think you're so ungrateful for all the money for us. This is outrageous. Yeah, no, I'd agree. But obviously, I also wouldn't agree that we should set a precedent for like mass confiscations. That would also be a bit. That would not set a great precedent if suddenly in Britain we went, well, because of 1066, anyone with a Norman surname will now surrender 100% of their estate by Normans. That might not go well.
Probably not. So are you now agreeing with my taxation is theft position because you don't want to set a norm of mass confiscation, or are you saying something
Well, that's
else?
what I'm saying. Is that I'm saying like I like property rights for the sake of I like property rights for their utility, and I think particularly taxation on earned income is not cool in principle, but obviously governments still need to raise revenue. And then there's a question of like how much revenue do they need to raise? Like what's the minimum obligation of the state, obviously. I guess the argument, I guess it leads you to quite Georgist conclusions if you take these things in combination.
The problem I have with Georgism is that it seems like some people build things and acquire a large legitimate fortune and then invest in a coal mine. And so it seems then like if there's someone who built his wealth by running a successful coffee shop and then he buys a coal mine, it seems very unjust to then confiscate his coal mine on the grounds that a coal mine is a natural resource.
For sure. And obviously people buy and develop land with the purpose of I want to have something for my descendants, and that's a motivator for a lot of human achievement is what sort of world do you want to leave generally to your descendants, but also people create great things and for the benefit of specific groups that they have in mind. but it's still the groups that they have in mind, not whatever the state decides. And like you don't want to take away that incentive when so much of human achievement is geared to that end. Like people are always trying to escape mortality in this way, which would be futile in the grand scheme. You know, like how many amazing figures do we remember from 3,000 years ago, and how many of their estates are here today? But hey, it might last you for a couple thousand years if you're lucky. So maybe it's worthwhile there. And regardless, it seems to motivate people. So we should obviously got to be wary of that. Got to bear that in mind when deciding what to penalize tax wise. But I mean, I'm not an anarchist. So in that sense, I kind of feel like it's a matter of finding the least worst taxes.
I'm an anarchist, pretty much.
Okay.
I think that, well, so there's kind of a standard minarchist line that the government should only have police, courts, and a military. Do you understand why it's those three things?
I feel like I'm on trial now. Do you
Okay,
understand?
I'll do a diversion into that then. So
Yeah, go ahead.
It's wrong to violate someone's rights. So it's wrong to murder them. It's wrong to steal from them. It's wrong to kidnap them. And so the minarchist idea is that the government will only enforce those rights. So the government will prevent murder and kidnapping and stealing. And that requires police, courts, and military.
Yeah.
So that's why it's those three. And maybe the government would also prevent large-scale pollution that would start to impact everyone, because that would be a violation of their rights as well.
Right.
But it does not include a social welfare plan, and it does not include like basic science funding or stuff like that. So that's why people say that that's why a lot of the people who talk about small government are okay with having a military, because it's within the very narrow government goal of just enforcing rights. So I think I would be okay with a government like that, but every government has to be funded somehow. And so I prefer to just have local organizations get together and write their own covenants and then make their own plans for how they're going to get along. And then they could appoint their own community police officer.
And then you kind of build up a state.
Well, it would be a society. It could have all of the social institutions that we're used to. There just would not be an overarching government.
Yeah. I'm not gonna like declare minarchism right now, but yeah, it perfectly coherent position. I see the appeal. I think the reason I'm not going to declare minarchism is because in some ways I'm kind of Burkean. I kind of like hey, institutions are organic things, and so there's a relevance to look at what we've got and go, what would be an improvement with this, and that's what I'm interested in more than the ruminations on what would be perfect. And I can think like what outcomes do we want, like what rights do we want respected, what prosperity do we want, what kind of prosperity, or like what vision of prosperity, let's say, and think, okay, so what changes with the institutions we have would move us towards that. And that can also be building new institutions and like changing them significantly. Like Burke's used as a conservative lion today, but he was a reformist for his time, and he was okay with like American independence. These are kind of big changes. So it's not like being a Burke. I think a lot of people who would call themselves Burkeans today would be more conservative than Burke was. I mean, being a Burkean certainly allows for big changes while also being cognizant of the fact, like, hey, the relevant thing is, how are you going to go from today to tomorrow? Bearing in mind what the constraints are today and what the risks would be of rebuilding from square one.
That's a fair point.
I think that has, yeah. I think so. So I think that's why I'd be like reluctant to be drawn into I find it interesting to discuss the ideals because then it kind of gives an idea of like, well, where should we be moving towards? But I'm not gonna be a, a born again X.
Well, I have a meeting coming up at 3.
Sure.
Do we have any final thoughts?
No, I've had a great time. I've had a
likewise.
good back and forth with you. Oh, actually, wait. So do you have 18 minutes?
I do, yes.
Actually, I wanna pester you on something. Now that I think of it. So I read your stuff on democracy. There are a couple of articles, I think, on democracy.
Yes.
I thought this was fascinating to me. And you seem to be making a case of like, hey, obviously lots of people like Peter Thiel are talking about tension between democracy and liberty, and we shouldn't like idolize democracy as the.
Was this in The Hill or was it on my Substack?
I cannot remember.
I think I wrote one on my Substack and another in The Hill, which I might have linked to on Substack. But okay.
I've definitely read the one on the Hill, but I can't remember what I'm taking.
Oh, okay. Okay. So
I mean.
You said Peter Thiel and we shouldn't idolize democracy.
Yeah. And you were talking about like, hey, if a mob, I think this was in a Substack, if a mob takes a person and they vote to hang a random guy, that doesn't make it chill. They're still hanging a random guy, hanging a random person. And they don't really have any right to do that. And I'm like, okay, great. But I guess this is a sort of, no, I don't want to use the term, but pragmatist. Calling yourself a pragmatist is so obnoxious though. But hopefully you'll see where I'm coming from in a minute. I just feel like, well, surely the defense of democracy is just, or rather, a defense of something like in the US republicanism or in the UK parliamentarianism is, well, like parliamentary system, is that, hey, these systems do quite a good job of protecting individual rights and of leading to reasonably good societies.
Well,
and
I just don't think it's true, though.
Okay. But then what's the confidence in there being the better alternative?
I'm not even sure I have to be committed to there being a better alternative. I think it's important to point out that things are not justified merely because they're democratic. And we should be focusing on good policy. And a lot of people get caught up in like arguing what the right form of government is. Should it be democracy or monarchy or whatever? I think that's a distraction. The thing we should really be focused on is whether we have good policy. I would rather live in a monarchy with good policy than a democracy with bad policy.
Yeah. I think my claim is just saying that systems that are roughly democratic, like the republic in the US and the parliamentary system in the UK, do a reasonable job of creating good outcomes. As in, to the extent that I'm not convinced that another system would do a better job.
Well, I'm not convinced that another system would do a much worse job. I mean, Liechtenstein is a monarchy. It seems to be doing pretty well.
Yeah, I'm not sure how generalizable really, really small states are.
That's true. It's a very small state. I think part of the problem is that nearly all of the rich developed countries are democracies, so there's nothing to compare to.
But maybe that's not a coincidence.
Well, but part of the reason why they became democracies is because they were defeated in wars by democratic powers and forced to be democracies. The
But
reason
also
why
maybe
Japan,
that's not a coincidence.
yeah, but like the reason why Japan is a democracy is because it was defeated by America, and Western Europe and America had a giant head start over Japan technologically and economically, and they even had a head start over Germany technologically and economically.
Yeah. Yeah, I
So,
agree that like clearly we don't have a proper experiment of loads and loads of different simulations that we can be sure are representative of what reality would be, in which we can try loads of different combinations. Sure. But also I think it's funny that like which were the first two countries to have long run economic growth? It started in England and Holland, according to research based on like what little data we have. And that's quite funny. These two countries, the Black Death, and this was in the wake of the Black Death. Black Death affected like all of Eurasia, and two countries out of that started to have long run growth, and presumably that was something to do with the social and or political and or economic structure of these places. And then
what's the relevance of the Black Death?
Well, it seemed to happen after the Black Death.
Maybe.
I think, yeah. Well, that's what this one study finds, is that they reckon it was after the Black Death that the Dutch had 0.2% trend economic growth, which is very impressive on a trend level. To sustain that for hundreds of years is pretty good going. And the English 0.1. But that's very interesting to me. And you know, at the time, England was quite a poor country in Europe, and then we've been. Sorry.
Oh, you're saying England at the time was a poor country in Europe?
Yeah. And then within a few hundred years, they did a little Uno reverse.
Right.
Sorry?
I just don't think that's I don't think the history of England and Holland being democratic, and they certainly were the first to start growing economically. I don't think that's a very impressive example in case of democracy, because it seems like you could use the same kind of argument for anything culturally specific about Northwestern Germanic people.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying
like
I'm not
Germanic
saying
languages. There were these two countries that both spoke Germanic languages, and look at how much economic growth they had.
I think this proves the superiority of the logic of the Germanic language. That was where I was going to all along. I don't know what this.
And also, it makes it a lot less impressive that they're right next to each other. Like if it were the case that the first two countries to start growing economically were like on opposite sides of the world, and they both just happened to become democratic and then start growing immediately, that would be impressive. But when England and Holland are like basically right next to each other, it seems like there's some other underlying cultural feature that just happened.
I think family structure. I think family structure was a lot of it.
I think that was part of it.
And I think the family structure is probably partly a function of the geography. That it was neither too mountainous, too much of a plain. So the geography naturally lends itself to having an absolute nuclear family system. Which, and then I think I wrote a Substack on this, and I think that allows for just the right level of a wealth distribution where you have like a proto middle class that can actually start experimenting with the surplus per capita that a Black Death brings, because suddenly you have more land and capital per person. But you know, whereas in societies that are more unequal, you have a small number of households that actually have added surplus to innovate with. And we saw this in England and Holland. They then had, like shortly afterwards, like the earliest sort of factories that sprung up there. And so I think that's kind of cool. But I'm just saying, well, but
wait, when were the earliest factories?
Sorry?
What year did the earliest factory spring up?
I believe even in the 14th century, there was this kind of mass like sheep's wool bundling thing. But so I'm not sure if you can definitely call it a factory, but it seems like something resembling a sort of mass production.
Yeah.
That probably benefited from some economy of scale, division of labor within it. Yeah, but yeah, maybe you could also argue that these cultures then created parliamentary democracies, and then that's why they're stagnating now. I mean, you could always theoretically say that. It's not really an argument for democracy being great, but it's interesting that these things come together at the very least, you could say.
Weren't there pretty democratic Italian city-states?
Well, were they democratic or were they oligarchic?
Well, maybe they were oligarchic. You might be right.
But I think people probably disagree on that, and I'm not an expert on the Italian city-states. But you hear conflicting things. But yeah, I mean, maybe, ancient Athens had sort of like 5,000 citizens. That's a reasonably sized electorate. You wouldn't call that an oligarchy. And then that still seemed vulnerable to cycles of despotism and oligarchy and democracy. So I'm still just yet to be convinced of an alternative that will work better, because any dictatorship is vulnerable to the errors of a dictator who is not going to be held as accountable. Any oligarchy is likely to be led by whatever the whims of like the fads of the oligarchic class and the interests of the oligarchic class push it into. So I'm just not convinced of there being a system that I would risk rejecting democratic institutions for.
Well, I don't need to sell you on an alternative system. I think I just need to persuade people that the democratic institutions might be less important than people think, in which case you can be more willing to risk them.
Okay.
Well, it's been great talking to you, Peter.
Okay, understood. But I'm not going to be drawn into comment because I live in the United Kingdom.
Oh, I see.
But yeah, it's been wonderful talking to you. I've had a great time.
Yeah. Let's do this again sometime.
Yeah, for sure. I'd like that. Yeah. But anyway, enjoy your meeting.
Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.